Today's lesson is Antony and Cleopatra. Venus, cried the excited people of Tarsus. Venus has come, they cried as they crowded the waterfront of that city in Asia Minor, late one summer afternoon. Venus has come to visit Bacchus, they cried to one another, watching as in a dream the most beautiful Egyptian galley they had ever seen, gliding up the river out onto the lake before them. They had been expecting Cleopatra. They had known that she was coming to meet Antony there in the city of Tarsus. They had been prepared to see a gorgeous Egyptian galley with purple sails and oars of silver, even a golden stern, but no such ship as this. This was one of an unearthly beauty, as to have come only from their immortal cloudland of the gods. Music drifted to their ears as it drew near, strange enhancing melodies on harps and flutes and pipes. Exotic, too, was the scent of spices and the pale blue drifting smoke of incense. Youths, beautiful as young gods, could be seen standing at the helm and rudder. Girls in draperies thin as evening mist were poised so lightly in the rigging as to seem to be floating in the quiet air. Beings from another world, attendants, couriers, they might well be, of an immortal queen. And there, see, there beneath the golden canopy, there was a reclining figure. Was not a goddess? There in the shimmering robe and the high, shining headdress, that radiant creature, could that be anyone but the immortal Venus, queen of love and beauty? Venus, cried the people, carried along by their imagination until for them fancy had turned into fact. Venus had come to visit Bacchus. Let someone go to Antony at once. Bid him come quickly to welcome his heavenly visitor. Antony was easily found, though not attired like Bacchus that afternoon, but as a Roman magistrate. Seated in the public square of Tarsus, he had been holding court, deciding arguments between petty rulers and ambassadors, among them, as usual, Jews complaining about Herod. Although the square had been almost emptied by people by the ship's arrival, Antony still sat there struggling to look dignified and control his curiosity. He, too, had been expecting Cleopatra. He had sent an ambassador to Egypt asking the queen to meet him there in Tarsus, and he was very glad that she had come. He had need of her. The city of Asia had been taxed and retaxed and squeezed out of almost their last cent, but there was gold in Egypt if it could be had, and gold was what he needed. For now Antony was beginning to think of undertaking the campaign which Julius Caesar had been planning just before he died. Lands yet to be conquered farther east were now tempting him as they had tempted Caesar. Babylonian, Persian, all that fabulous land east of the Euphrates River, which now belonged to Parthia, the only undefeated rival of the Romans. Come ashore and have dinner with me, was the message from Antony, now sent to Cleopatra. Her reply was an invitation to come aboard ship instead and dine with her. He would give her pleasure, she assured him. Antony accepted. Why refuse a lady pleasure, especially a lovely one? And so, with that invitation and acceptance, one of the world's most famous love stories began. Some of Antony's officers and certain dignitaries of the city had also been invited. Daylight had faded into dark when they reached the harbor. Myriads of tiny lights outlined the ships and were reflecting in the water. On board, everywhere, the tiny lights were multiplied 1,000 times in the mirrors in the wine, in the glistening jewels gown of Cleopatra, and in the wondrous pear-shaped pearls swinging from her ears. It was a fairyland. Antony was spellbound at once by the fascinating queen, now to him even more glamorous than she had appeared in Rome when she was there with Caesar. To Cleopatra, the big Roman, too, seemed more attractive, far than in her memory of him. She admired his hard muscles as he lay stretched upon his dining couch, which was placed beside her own. The feast was lavish, rare, delicious food, served on platters of gold. The plates, too, were of gold, and the golden drinking cups were studded with jewels. "They are yours, all of them," Cleopatra said to Antony when the feast was over. "They are nothing, truly, just a small remembrance," she added lightly, slowly withdrawing her slim fingers from his large hand, which had closed over them too long in parting. And they were, those plates and cups of gold, a mere fraction of the treasure which Cleopatra had brought with her for a definite purpose. She wanted to dazzle Antony, to convince him of the vast wealth of Egypt that might be his if he would share his power in the Roman world with her. If Antony would lay claim to Rome in the name of little Protimally Caesar, all the riches and powers of the world might be theirs together. Why should Antony support Octavian, Caesar's nephew? Was not Caesar's own son a mere rightful heir to his father's power? Alone without help, Cleopatra knew that she could do little for the future of that 7-year-old son of hers. She saw clearly that in days to come he might not even have the throne of Egypt left to him. With unfriendly rule in Rome, Egypt, instead of being allowed to remain an independent kingdom, might be made just another province in the Roman Empire, and the rule of the Ptolemies would end. But if only she could persuade Antony that his best chance lay with Egypt, then the brightest future possible might be ahead of them. With so much at stake, Cleopatra had now come to Tarsus, prepared to use all her wit and charm upon Antony, to dazzle him with her riches, to hail him as a god, to promise him her love, herself, all that she had to give in return for his alliance. Her favorite ladies in waiting, Charmaine and Iris, were eagerly watching for her to awake the morning following the banquet. As soon as they saw her eyelids flitter open, they knew that she was in high spirits and that the first evening had been a great success. There was lifting music in her voice as she called in Ethiopians to the slave girls who prepared her bath and spoke to each attendant in her native language, for she spoke them all. Catching her gaiety, Charmaine and Iris planned to outdo themselves and make their lovely lady even more bewitching for the feast that evening. Which tunic should she wear? Which would display her graceful figure to the best advantage? What jewels? How many necklaces? What bracelets and earrings? And how should her hair be dressed? Bound in the Greek fashion or coiled back softly, leaving a frame of small, tight curls about her face. These and hundreds of other delightful details were all to be decided later, when Cleopatra herself was seated at the dressing table. It was then a question of which ruse to use, which perfume should be most seductive. Should the clear arch of her eyebrows be made a trifle blacker, and the eyeshadow on her lower lid applied with a swan's feather? Should that not be drawn just a little farther toward the corner of her eyes? "Am I beautiful? Do I please you?" Cleopatra laughed as they admired their handiwork. "This night, as you know, my dears, and each night must excel in every way the one before it." The banquet of the second night was more splendid than the first, and that of the fourth night was so resplendent that Antony declared that it would be impossible to excel or even equal it in luxury. No one, he wagered, could spend more on a single feast. "I accept your wager," said Cleopatra with a tantalizing smile. "I could spend 10 million sesterces on the food alone. I shall prove it. Shall we say tomorrow night?" At least the feast of the next night appeared no different from the others, to the disappointment of the guests, but to the satisfaction of Antony, who felt that he had won the wager. But wait. At the end of the last court, Cleopatra was beckoned to a slave. A tiny, jewel-encrusted cup of gold was set before her and filled with vinegar. Raising her hand, she removed from her ear one of her two precious pear-shaped pearls. Watching Anthony as she did so, she then dropped it into the little cup, waiting a moment for it to dissolve, and then drank its contents. A gasp of shocked astonishment went up from all who saw the wanton destruction of this rare pearl, worth easily half of the amount wagered. For all believed that the pearl had been dissolved, except perhaps the very clever little person who had swallowed it. "Stop," explained the officer chosen to decide the wager as he saw her reaching for the other. "Do not destroy it. You have won." Cleopatra had won. She had won the wager, and she had won Antony. His heart went with her when, at the end of the few weeks, she returned to Egypt, where, it had been decided, he was shortly to follow her. All desire for an immediate campaign against Parthia had now faded away before the more glamorous prospect of a winter in Alexandria to be spent with Cleopatra. Alexandria was the Paris of the ancient world, its most beautiful and sophisticated city, one in which each kind of pleasure was available, from the highest of the mind and spirit to the lowest of the senses. In all of them, Anthony was indulged. It was a winter extravagant delight, that winter which united the most powerful Roman in the world with the world's most glamorous queen. Their union, although sanctioned by the Egyptian priest, was outside the Roman law. But did that matter? Were not queens and rulers above the common law? Could Venus and Bacchus be bound by the ties of this mere mortal world? They could not, and so deeply in love were Antony and Cleopatra that they quite forgot about the Roman world until early spring, when suddenly bad news broke through this enchantment. News traveled slowly by land during the winter months when the Mediterranean was rough. But with spring the ships came again, and they brought bad news. In the spring of 40 BC, both from Rome and from Asia, Antony tried to turn a deaf ear to the loud calls of help, but it was impossible. At home in Rome, Fulvia, Antony's disagreeable and now jealous wife, had stirred up trouble with Octavia to the point of war. In Asia, the king of Parthia, now waiting for the Romans to make war on him, had invaded Syria and seized Roman territory. Bad business both places. Uncertain which place to go first, Anthony set out for Asia Minor. From there he could go either way. Cleopatra watched him leave with a very heavy heart. He kissed her briefly in a hurried parting, assured her that he would soon return, that they would rule the world together, to be good and not to worry. Then, while she watched, the ship disappeared from sight. And what had she felt? Only promises. And could she trust him? Would those vague promises be kept? She wondered, feeling quite alone now and deserted. 4 years she would have to wait and wonder, for it was to be 4 years before Cleopatra would see Antony again, or before he would see the twins, his twin baby boy and girl, who were to be born that summer, Alexander the sun and Cleopatra the moon.